This brings me on then to the concept of autobiographical memory. As I've said already, autobiographical memory is not a videotape account of our lives. If we think of examples of events that we remember with a friend or with a parent where you're convinced you were wearing a red dress but your friend says you were wearing a blue dress, and for both of you it's a very real memory, and yet you can't agree on the precise sort of circumstances and context. So our memories are not videotape accounts of our lives. They're shaped by subsequent conversations, the type of Chinese whispers type of thing. They're shaped by other people's views. So we want our accounts of our lives to fit in with the views of people who are important to us. So our impression of our lives is shaped by the people around us who make us feel good. And there's a self-centred bias such that your memories of your life tend to be positive on the whole. Of course, we have very negative events that we remember, but we like to maintain a positive sense of self, and autobiographical memory is very closely related to our sense of self. It doesn't do us well if our memories are negative. It's not functional, it's not adaptive for us. So it's very much a sort of self-centred bias. So autobiographical memory, as an example, eyewitness memory being an example of that, is very important in the police interview situation. Now, the police interview traditionally had no real structure. The police didn't have a formula for interviewing people. It was all very haphazard, and they were guilty of asking leading questions because there wasn't sufficient understanding about autobiographical memory. So it's only very recently that psychologists have had that scientific basis by which to suggest to the police ways in which it would be appropriate to conduct interviews with eyewitnesses. And there are very famous cases of miscarriages of justice that have arisen from mistakes in the police interview process. And if I just illustrate one here, it's a very famous one. Stefan Kishko was convicted of the murder of an 11-year-old girl in 1976. This girl was tragically murdered. They looked for a suspect. It didn't take them very long to come across Stefan Kishko. They took him in for questioning, and he was mercilessly questioned over 2 days and ultimately confessed to killing the girl. He was a low intelligence individual, severe mental and physical problems, and he wasn't told he could have a solicitor. The police misinformed him. They asked him leading questions that resulted in him confessing, and he confessed because for an easy life, basically. And here's what he said when describing his confession. He said, "I started to tell these lies and they seemed to please them," this is the police, "and the pressure was off as far as I was concerned. I thought if I admitted what I did to the police, they would check out what I had said, find it untrue, and would then let me go." Kishko served 16 years in jail before finally being released. The real murderer was subsequently caught with DNA evidence and is now serving life sentence. Tragically, a year after Kishko was released from jail, he died, and it was not until 2007 that he was fully exonerated and an apology was made by the Crown and by the police. So here's a very tragic example of an individual who, because of an unfair police interview process, served 16 years in jail. So the police needed to learn to improve things in terms of the interview process, and so they started consulting with psychologists about means by which they could do this. And a very popular tool, and it's by no means the only tool that's used in police interviewing, but it is quite widely used, is the cognitive interview. Now, the cognitive interview relies on two key concepts in cognitive psychology. The first is encoding specificity, and this is the notion that a memory is better when it's retrieved in the same context as the event occurred at encoding. So if you're in the same context when you're remembering information as you were when the event originally occurred, when the learning occurred, then you'll remember more. The second is mood-dependent learning, such that if you're in the same mood at retrieval, again, your memory is better than if you were in a different mood between encoding and retrieval. So if you keep the context steady, if you keep the mood steady, then you're more likely to retrieve more information. And that's a tip that you can use in your learning and your A-level work, as well as in these real-world sort of applied settings. So there are some key principles to the cognitive interview. The first is that witnesses are told to retrieve whatever they can, no matter how fragmentary. So whatever little snippets, we don't need it to be complete, whatever you can think of, random things, what the weather was like and so on. Because what we know as psychologists is that those random fragments may well lead to more information. They may be a means by which to unlock a richer memory seam, if you like. Second is they try alternative means to retrieve. So if we start at 7 a.m. in the morning and you can remember a bit of what happened but not fill it all in, okay, maybe then let's cut to lunchtime. Start off from that period. So a very simple matter of just trying different entry points to the memory is a really good way to unlock more memories. Similarly, alternative perspectives provide alternative retrieval opportunities. So you might say, okay, you're telling me what happened from your point of view, so what do you think the driver of the car saw? So by putting them in an alternative perspective, you get them to think about it in different ways. Very successful means by which to get at more information. And the final point is that interrupting a witness is discouraged. So don't, whatever you do, stop them mid-flow because you might then lose the memory that they're in the process of retrieving. So what are the benefits of the cognitive interview then? Well, first is that it's structured. It improves a lot on the completely random nature of the questions that the police had been asking. According to the Fisher et al. 1989 study, up to 50% more memories can be retrieved. So it's very clear that people remember very much more information when you give them this semi-structured interview than when you simply ask them to remember free-form what happened. And with the open-ended nature of the question, witnesses remember events in their own words, on their own terms. So it's very much about getting somebody to tell us what happened without putting words in their mouths. Okay, those are the pros, so what are the cons? What are the drawbacks of cognitive interviewing? Well, first of all, it is very much more time-consuming for police than simply asking somebody to remember. So it takes up a lot more time. It's very intensive for the interviewer as well. So the interviewer is having constantly to monitor so that they work out whether we need to go back to this particular point or not. So it's a very intensive experience for the interviewer as well as for the eyewitness, obviously. It's only useful with cooperative witnesses. So obviously, you're encouraging somebody to tell you as much as they can about what happened, but that's not going to work if you've got someone who doesn't want to tell the story. So the cognitive interview is not going to yield any more memories for somebody who just wants to keep stum and doesn't want to tell you what's actually happened. There's still, despite its semi-structured nature, there is still the danger of asking leading questions. So by asking somebody, what was the weather like? What the policeman is doing is setting up an expectation in the subject, in the witness, that they should remember what the weather was like. So what were you wearing on that night 3 years ago? Now, those are questions that the police routinely ask in the interview process. But as psychologists, we appreciate that actually those relatively minor details are unlikely to be stored long term. So if I ask you, for example, what were you wearing last Tuesday? You would struggle to remember. So what were you wearing 3 years ago? When the gun was pointed at your face, I think you might have other things on your mind. So is the cognitive interview optimal then? Is it the best thing the police could be using? Well, it has its pros and cons. I've just outlined them there. It's a big improvement on traditional interviewing techniques. It's one of the best things that the police have got, although there are variations on the cognitive interview that the police are using, so it's constantly being developed in ways that make it more scientifically rigorous a method of investigating memory. Memory, as I said before, is more fragmentary than we realise. By asking people questions about weather, clothes and so on, we're maybe not getting at the real point. It's not about the clothes that somebody was wearing. It's not about the weather. And I think that a too detailed account of something that happened a very long ago is something that we should be suspicious of. As I said already, other tools are available as well. So the cognitive interview is a prominent tool, but it's by no means the only one, and our techniques are constantly evolving to optimally get at what makes a real memory. So to summarise then, eyewitnesses giving evidence rely very heavily on their autobiographical memory. Second, police need to be careful in the way they structure interviews. So they need to be very careful that they don't ask leading questions, that they leave it sufficiently open-ended, that they don't suggest to eyewitnesses that they should be remembering things that it's not reasonable to expect them to remember. And finally, the cognitive interview is a key tool that's used in forensic settings. It has its pros and cons, and as psychologists, what we're trying to do is constantly to look at ways to improve it.